It's another interesting edition of the Market Review where we discuss key developments in the financial and capital market as it affects the economy. Our focus today will be on the prospects for climate finance in Nigeria, and my guest is Dr. Evans Osano, Director Capital Markets, FSD Africa. Nice to have you on the program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. To our viewers, before we begin the conversation, let us give you a wrap of some major market stories from last week. To reduce the distortion of companies' public information and market data, Nigeria Exchange Limited urged investors to disclose their substantial interest in listed companies not later than 10 business days after such a transaction. According to NGX, sudden announcements of previously undisclosed interest breached the exchange's rules as well as the other extant market laws. The exchange, in a statement recently released, disclosed that it was mindful of an upcoming trend by investors, adding that the disclosure obligations are provided under the exchange's rules, the Companies and Allied Matters Act 2020, and the Consolidated Rules and Regulations of the Securities and Exchange Commission of 2013. The FMDQ exchange announced the approval for the registration of the Capital Sage Technology Limited 15 billion commercial paper program on its platform. Those are some of the interesting stories from the market last week. If you're joining us, it's the Market Review, and our conversation today is on the prospect for climate finance in Nigeria. My guest is Dr. Evans Osano, Director of Capital Markets, FSD Africa. Doctor, we're in unprecedented times as we can see the impact of climate change on global economic activities, especially in emerging markets like Nigeria. How critical is climate finance to addressing the challenges of flooding, environmental pollution, and other related challenges in the country? Last week, our government was talking about exploring it too.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. So maybe let's take a step back and say why this is important for Nigeria. So Nigeria, as you mentioned, has two major risks from climate change. So flooding in the south, and then the risk of desertification in the north. And then when you put all this in the context of Nigeria's development pathway, where population is expected to rise from about 206 million to about 401 million by 2050, the third largest, most populous country in the world, it means there's quite a bit of investment that is needed. And also the fact that Nigeria is also urbanizing quite quickly, from 52% urban population to about 68% by 2050. So it means Nigeria has to invest a lot in urban infrastructure, in housing, in creating jobs. And then, of course, there are also very significant implications on agricultural production and all that. So in all that context, it's very important that Nigeria does not continue to invest in a pathway that locks in very high carbon emissions in the future. So it's mostly around avoiding sort of future emissions, but also taking advantage of the climate finance flows that is currently abundant and looking for opportunities. So Nigeria has committed, like many other countries, to what we call nationally determined contributions. When you look at the financing package that is required, it's $17.7 billion per annum. But what is coming in at the moment is about $1.9 billion, and that's about 11% of what is required annually. So it's a very small percentage of that. And then you look at where that funding is going, most of it is going into renewable energy, about 66% of what we call the mitigation investments. Agriculture, which is important for Nigeria, I think accounts for about 24% of GDP, is only attracting about 16% of the climate finance flows. So 1.9 billion, to put it in the African context, is not bad. It's about 7% of the flows into Africa, and it's about 27% of the flows into West Africa. But in the context of Nigeria's GDP, $432 billion is a drop in the ocean. So we need to raise the level of ambition. And then when we break down where is that funding coming from, about 80% of that is actually coming from external sources. And those external sources are actually predominantly public sources of financing. So from DFIs and the bilaterals. The private sector is only accounting for about 23% of the flows. So the key message is basically to say, how do we improve the flows of climate finance from the private sources? And two, how do we increase the share of the domestic capital that is going into climate finance, both from the banking industry as well as the capital markets? I think that's the challenge. So how do we basically increase the level of ambition from 1.9 to 17.7 billion that is required? How do we take advantage of the opportunities that we have in the different sectors, in infrastructure, in agriculture, in housing, and all that. Yeah. And on the renewable energy, if I just say something very quick on that, what Nigeria needs on the renewable energy space is probably $122 billion. That's what the NDC for Nigeria indicates. And so you break it down per annum between 2021 to 2030, that's $12.2 billion. That is an investment opportunity. We just need to align financing to meet that opportunity. By 2060, Nigeria is going to be needing about $410 billion to go into renewable investment, 10 billion per annum. That is an investment opportunity. We just have to align our financial sector, both domestic and internationally, to be able to address that need. That is also going to create an opportunity. And then finally, we also have to make sure that as we do that, we don't leave others behind. So we also address the issue of adaptation finance, which addresses the vulnerabilities in the economy as well.
Very, very important things you've highlighted, especially the need for the financial services industry and the capital markets to work together for capital, because capital is very key for achieving these whole issues. And you've seen already, like you rightly said, the flooding is really hitting hard in southern Nigeria. And of course, the North has experienced the desertification. But I must commend you partnering to release the report, Landscape of Climate Finance in Nigeria. And one of those issues raised are the issues of mobilizing private finance, the capacity also and coordination and technology, addressing those challenges. If you could speak to it in a minute, how all this connect together to ensure that we can really get it right in climate finance.
Yeah, so thank you so much. So as I said, climate finance presents threats, so which we have to address by basically becoming more resilient, and that requires investments, particularly from the public sector, because adaptation is more attuned to the public sector in many ways as well, but also the private sector to integrate that as well. And then we also do need to invest a lot more on the on mitigation, which is basically avoiding emissions in the future and all that. So as we build infrastructure that is resilient, we're building houses, build houses that are climate smart. And if we are going to invest in agriculture, also invest in climate smart agriculture. So for us to be able to do that, then several things have to come together. As I said, on the policy side, there's a lot that can be done to make the environment much more conducive for attracting those flows of capital. There is need, for example, to actionalize some of the policy that have been put in place, like the Climate Act. So there is the issue about the carbon tariffs or the carbon price. How do you set that so that the market becomes a bit more predictable, and there is a very strong signal that is given by the government in terms of where they want to see the flows going into. And then, of course, if you look at the private sector, capital markets, banking sector, the banking sector is relatively small in terms of, if you look at how much money is going into climate smart investment in Nigeria, from domestic banks, it's very, very small. So banks have to be much more intentional in understanding the risk and in also understanding the opportunity to drive investments or credit toward those sectors. The capital markets, very attuned to raising long-term capital, which is what is needed for housing and infrastructure. But how do you make that financing at scale into those sectors and all that? And how do you prepare projects that become financeable by the PFAs or by the insurance companies that are mobilizing long-term capital that can be invested? And then finally, also, I think it's very important to understand, because there are some sectors that are very difficult to abate, like natural resources, agriculture and all that. So we have to be much more intentional in addressing that. So I talked about agriculture. So in terms of emissions, I think it's about 25% that comes from what we call agriculture, forestry, and other land use. Yeah. So it's a very big percentage, and so we have to try and address that significant percentage by being very, very intentional on how we do that. So capacity building is also going to be needed as well. Issues of disclosure for financial institutions is probably going to be something that is important, so that they can disclose the risks and the opportunities they're also seeing from a climate financing perspective. As you say, if you can measure it, then perhaps you can be able to drive change towards that.
I mean, I really like what you've said about the role, and I must tell you, the financial markets, capital markets in Nigeria, they've been really, really exploring the opportunities in climate finance. I mean, we have a bank whose headquarters building is totally smart in terms of compliance with the renewable and the era we are. We even have several instruments that have been floated to support climate finance. We have a financial center for sustainability. So there's a lot of opportunities, like you said. It's just more of this coordination and, of course, the regulators supporting the whole ecosystem. But let's look at scaling up climate resilient infrastructure in Nigeria through adaptation financing. What are the opportunities for building this momentum in the country? Now that, like I said, last week we saw the interesting story that the government in Nigeria is exploring climate finance. And one area that can be achieved is through supporting and financing climate resilient infrastructure.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, there are a lot of financial instruments that can be used. So green bonds is one of them. So the sovereign in Nigeria has led the way by issuing 2 green bonds. They are relatively small, so we want to see much bigger issues coming out in the market. Then we also see a lot of opportunities in the sub-sovereign level. So states like Lagos State could also raise money through green bonds to invest in resilient infrastructure that addresses the flooding risk, for example, and others as well. So it's basically improving, I think, the level, the scale of ambition, because the scale of the challenge that we are facing requires us to think very big in terms of the solutions that we address. So it's not something that is going to be dealt at the margins and all that. That would be like dipping our foot in the water, but will not be able to address the challenge that we are facing. So we have to be much more ambitious in terms of what we want to achieve. Yeah. And financing, of course, is the key, and we can drive it to help us achieve those objectives. As well as we build, of course, that strong economic pathway, because those two stories are actually connected. So it's the issue about avoiding future emissions, because that is going to cause more problems for us. So we can be smarter in terms of how we invest. And I think finally, I can also say that we need to also put a little bit more focus in tracking what is flowing, because I think there's probably a lot of financing that is going into climate-related investments, but we're not necessarily tracking that. So if you can be able to improve the tracking at the sovereign level, federal levels, the state level, as well as the private sector, it might give us a much better picture of what kind of flows are coming through.
Very, very important, tracking too, apart from the flows. And as we wrap up, a conversation with the Deputy British High Commissioner to Nigeria, he talked about even climate insurance. Maybe we'll have to talk about subsequently when we feature it, but he said there's a huge opportunity for Nigeria and Africa to explore in terms of climate finance. But let's look at the summary of your report. It talked about the fact that Nigeria, the development path, can feasibly take business as usual or sustainable development, and that depends on the availability of climate finance moving forward. From your assessment, as we wrap up, what should be the top priority now that government is seeing this as a very important aspect of sustainable development?
Yeah, so again, financing aside, obviously there is also potential to collaborate with other governments. And as I said, Nigeria has done quite a number of very positive things on the policy side. That knowledge is something that can be shared across the African continent. So Nigeria showing leadership or demonstrating leadership will be quite good. And I know some initiatives like Africa Green Finance Coalition are very important ways of sharing information and all that. But again, I think if you're looking at scale, then it means that there are certain things that we have to do to really drive that financing there. So we have to change, in my mind, the mindset of both the public sector as well as the private sector towards supporting these types of investments. So it's not seen as something that sits out there. It should be something that is very, very much mainstreamed.
Very much mainstreamed, and that's how we can really achieve. And just like we've seen in the digital transformation, we could even say the green economy ecosystem, just like how the digital economy ecosystem. And once that is strengthened, we can begin to see how finance flows, and you can track it. And of course, invest in infrastructure to survive the adverse impact of climate change. And in the week of the collaborative effort for climate action, I think this is a very important conversation, and we hope that more of this will continue, and stakeholders from the policymakers to the private sector will see need to begin to take action, finance and policy working together. Thank you very much, Dr. Evans Osano, Director of Capital Markets, FSD Africa, for this interesting conversation on the prospects for climate finance in Nigeria. Indeed, there are huge prospects, but we must work together to make it happen. Thank you once again for the time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yes. That will be all for this edition of the Market Review Show. If you have questions or suggestions or even comments around the prospect for climate finance in Nigeria, you should have, because of the impact you're seeing already. Flooding displaced over 1 million Nigerians, over 600 people have lost their lives. This is a time for action. Send them to the email displayed on your screen. Also, you can follow us on our website, www.prosher.co, to get all the latest reports, market stories, and analysis as it has to do with the capital market and, of course, the developments around climate change and climate action. Don't forget to also follow us on our social media platforms displayed on the screen. To all our viewers, just to remind you that the 8th edition of the ProShare Online Trading Ranking Report is on. The survey is on, and you just need to be part of it. I mean, it's rich. It provides your perspective and experience using the trading platform. So please be part of it, as you can see on our website. Also, it's very important to be very, very active in understanding investment dynamics. Don't forget that you need to be informed to make the right investment decisions. Thank you for watching, and keep discussing and engaging on the financial market, because it will help you to make the right choice in the challenging times.